The Cannabis Conversation. A European perspective on the emerging legal cannabis industry.
Welcome to the Cannabis Conversation with Avnish Pandya, where we explore the new legal cannabis industry by speaking to the professionals that are helping to shape it. Hope you're all keeping well. Got a great episode coming up today, but I just wanted to mention a couple of upcoming events for those interested in the UK CBD sector. The Canna Consultants, who are a UK-based cannabis consultancy in association with RASB Media, are hosting a free-to-all webinar comprising two presentations by the UK Food Standards Agency on the novel food applications. Each presentation will be followed by a Q&A session covering two main areas. Firstly, the policy and technical elements of a novel food dossier, and secondly, the scientific, toxicology and ADME elements of a novel food dossier. It's a great chance to learn more about this issue, which will have a significant impact on the CBD sector in the UK and Europe, and also a great chance to quiz the regulators with any questions that you have. The deadline to submit questions is Thursday, the 2nd of July. I'll be providing links in my LinkedIn post featuring the show, so please check them out. Now, on with the show. Enjoy. On today's show, I have Jahan Peston Jamas and Avnish Pandya. Jahan and Avnish are from the Bombay Hemp Company, otherwise known as BOHECO, and they're here to talk about cannabis in India. Welcome, guys. How are you?
We're doing very well, Anuj. Thank you so much. I hope you're keeping fine as well.
Thank you. Yes. Yeah, strange times for all of us.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. No, great to connect, Anuj, and looking forward to the podcast.
Great. Cool. So listen, I'm really excited about this show. Obviously, of Indian heritage myself, there's a huge amount of interest, but obviously historically cannabis has a huge connection to India. So there's loads of stuff for us to talk about. As is traditional, why don't we start with a bit about yourselves and the Bombay Hemp Company, your backgrounds and how and why you started it.
So Bombay Hemp Company was a brainchild of the seven of us co-founders back in college. We all went to HR College of Commerce and Economics in Bombay. The primary understanding of cannabis was something that we developed during our travels within the rural hinterlands of India, when we were part of a social rural entrepreneurship project, which was basically around solar lighting. And while we were visiting different parts, we realized that there was this one common trajectory of crop that was growing wildly everywhere. And there was always that kind of an understanding that cannabis has this oomph factor to it, right? Like everybody has some kind of a unique story with cannabis. So we were definitely interested in it, and our exposure to it was primarily very rural. While we were visiting different places, we also started doing a little bit of research, saying that, okay, what is this plant? What are its uses? We are definitely aware of all its misuses by that time. And slowly and surely, we came to know the concept of hemp, which is like all the industrial uses, the fibrous uses, the 25,000 different plant uses that hemp has, etc., etc. So it began off as a hypothesis, saying that cannabis, and we definitely knew that cannabis was an Indian plant. It had Indian heritage, predominantly Central Asian heritage, if I may put it that way. Because back in the day, we didn't have in India. It was primarily different parts of Central Asia. And the point that we also had so much biodiversity and cultural linkages with the plant. Yeah, Jahan, you want to take that forward?
Sure. So I think, Avnish touched on a great point here, Anuj, is we realized that the phenomenon of using hemp or cannabis in different forms was extremely indigenous, historical and cultural in India. For example, as Avnish is mentioning, in villages in Punjab, it's been generational knowledge passed down from woman to woman to use the seed oil from the hemp or the bhang plant, as they refer to actually help with stretch marks post-pregnancy. Now, this kind of common knowledge is translated into the likes of Body Shop today and multi-million dollar cosmetic brands really kind of grasping at the hemp and sort of the CBD and the cannabis narrative. But we realized this knowledge was indigenous. For example, being in North Indian states, it's a very common cultural delicacy to actually infuse hemp seeds or bhang ki beej into chutneys and sort of local delicacies, majorly for its nutritional value and majorly to help them keep warm during the cold winters and the harsh winters in the north of India. And once we realized that during our travels, professionals, we used to actually do a lot of social enterprise work. But interestingly enough, along the way, whichever state we went to, whichever village we went to, culture, custom, language is different. But one commonality remained: cannabis grew everywhere. It was so ubiquitous, where today over time we've learned that almost 60% of all districts in India see the natural growth of the cannabis or the hemp plant, which is approximately upwards of about 400,000 plus hectares of just natural growing hemp and cannabis. That is a gold mine of biodiversity which is waiting to be tapped. But the real question was, why hadn't India taken those steps forward? And that really led us into the journey with BOHECO and led us to hypothesize at a college level that could we do this at a college level, where we understood no, we were none the wiser. We needed to build white collar experience and come back, revisit this at a more opportune time, which is where post college we all kind of went our separate ways. We worked in different jobs in consultancy, in startups, in operations. In some of our founders did their legal degrees, some worked in marketing, advertising, etc., and built sort of a really good kind of profile in line with what roles we would take up if we were to take BOHECO. And by I think 2012, I think Avnish would also come in here. By 2012, I think we had all kind of realized this was the time to actually look at hemp and cannabis, considering sort of the indigenous ancient knowledge, and sort of BOHECO being a pioneer and creating an entity as a pioneer to set a more positive legacy for the plant.
Wow, there's so much there. There's huge amounts there. I think you've mentioned some great facts about India there, which we'll get into in a second. But your company, BOHECO. So first of all, one of the things that jumped out at me is you've got 7 founders. That's quite a lot. How have you managed that aspect? There's quite a lot of chiefs, let's say.
So I think the one thing that we had understood right from the start was that this was the kind of war where we would require not one but many generals. It was really not even a war when we started off, it was a hypothesis. It was an idea that was still building. So we weren't even sure of all the cannabis regulation within the country, how the central government, the state government looks at it, the nature of different parts of the plant, etc. So it was basically the fact that we would need somebody, the way we looked at it is we would need somebody who has good people skills, somebody who is good at actually selling and marketing a product. We would need somebody who has a strong legal background and a strong understanding, somebody with good analytical capability, somebody with good strategic mindset. So it was more about gathering these different skills and kind of putting them in one pot. But we realized gradually that we will have to create some kind of structure within the organization. So since then, BOHECO has evolved into much more of a formalized body where we have structured board of directors, we have specific leaders of different functional areas, and then we have CEO and CMOs and CXOs as well. So it was a logical part of the journey where, of course, we all started off pretty much in the same way, but all of us have developed our roles and our responsibilities in a way where they actually complement each other rather than being a hurdle or, too many cooks spoiling the broth kind of a thing. So that clear-cut demarcation is evolving. Yeah.
Yeah, and Anuj, it comes down primarily to trust, being able to trust each other with areas of specialty or expertise, and being able to build on that in terms of decision making, empowering each other to take quick decisions, and B, sort of unique and innovative decisions in the business process. And I think one thing we really point to even at Seven is we have really good kind of mechanisms even within the founder group to when it comes to crisis management or resolution of issues and disputes, where it has become a seemingly kind of much more clear to pathway to actually achieve. And I think the real backbone of it was the rapport we personally developed before we enter the enterprise, where there is sort of a good camaraderie that continues to exist regardless of which way a decision goes in a room, because all of us are, I think Elon Musk said it the best way. I think he said there's no concept like a company or a startup. There's only a group of individuals working towards one common collective goal, and that is basically any organization. And we realize that stems from the top. So being able to reflect that maturity eventually trickles down to the rest of the team that we built over time with BOHECO. And that's why being a lot more evolving and mature and understanding with decision making, and keeping the scope open to be open-minded for a perspective from another founder or director that one might not have had, because we might have been boxed in with our thoughts or been only thinking from, say, one specific mindset, really makes it a lot more holistic in terms of being able to have a greater intellectual output as well as a business output at the end of the day.
Yeah, that's brilliant. I really love loads of stuff that you just talked about there. And I think it's really good advice for any budding entrepreneurs who are looking at starting up businesses. And I like the fact that you approached it from a kind of skill set perspective of where are the gaps and which bits do we need to fill in order to make this work. So well done on doing that. I don't think you guys actually talked about exactly what BOHECO does, actually. So what are the areas that you're involved in?
So predominantly, Bo-hee-ko is a vertically integrated cannabis company that is focusing predominantly on the health and wellness aspect, which is coming from the leaves and the seeds of the cannabis plant. A major part of Bo-hee-ko is also into the biotech aspect of studying different unique land races that are part of our biodiversity and chemotyping and phenotyping them in terms of their genetic makeup as well as their chemical makeup. And as well, Bo-hee-ko started off working towards the fiber aspect of the cannabis plant, but now has kind of picked up on the health and wellness aspect and looks at that area as the major focus going into the future. Bo-hee-ko also has manufacturing and R&D licenses with different reputed state as well as central government institutes across the country.
And on a regulatory and policy front, because we realize this is the complete vertical integration, it goes even pre-cultivation. It actually includes developing policies. We've been working with between 4 to 6 state governments across India over the last 7.5 years to help them frame, adapt, and sort of rework and modify existing policies for industrial hemp, medical cannabis, as well as bhang-based policy, licensing, cultivation, sort of across the country in different layers of policy advancement as well. So we realize it's sort of three foundations. One is policy regulation, second being fundamental research and core research on genetics and cultivation and being able to scale that up, and then taking it to the end mile of consumer goods and the commercialization in the health and the wellness segments.
Wow, brilliant. That's a really good and sophisticated approach to it, I think. And there's loads of stuff I'd like to talk about there. Actually, I'd like to pick up on one of the things that you mentioned around land races. So we had Dr. Ethan Riso on the show a few weeks ago, and we talked a little bit about land races. And I think he kind of mentioned that arguably there are no genuine land races still around because there's been human influence on all of them. Maybe we take a step back, and how do you guys define land races, and what do you think about, are they all kind of slightly selectively bred, or are there really kind of a lot of wild and natural strains that are being grown?
Yeah, so I think what Dr. Russo was talking about must be predominantly for the more developed parts of the world where cannabis wasn't actually originating from or predominantly a native crop to in some way. But if you go to see Central Asian regions of Afghanistan, Pakistan, Kazakhstan, all the way stretching up to Mongolia and the northern parts of China and India, you would see there are lots of forest areas and protected forests that still have lots of different types of cannabis that is naturally growing year on year or season by season by replenishing its own seed. So there's definitely the definition of a land race for us is something that has not been yet kind of in some way captured from a chemistry perspective or from genetic mapping perspective. So yes, we do understand that there would be a certain distance in between calling something a unique land race. There would be a certain geographical area that it would cover, but there's definitely a lot of unique cannabis plants with varying physiologies that we can see. So I would not get into the taxonomical debate about what an actual land race would be, but from a broader perspective, it's about finding unique cannabis plants with these connections.
And sort of a succinct point to add on top of this, Anuj, is a key factor being the lack of appropriate mapping of all the land races, natural land races existing across the geographies in India. And I think I'll take one sort of interesting anecdote where in I think year 2 or year 3, our scientific team, and they do this every year, we actually collect and we update our cannabis seed genetic bank, which includes about 300 different land races and sort of natural growing varieties from across India, about 12 to 14 different states. During one of their expeditions into Manipur, they came across sort of land races that were growing naturally in rural parts of northeast Manipur and close to the jungle areas that were actually producing flowering tops and floss that were almost blue and purple in tincture and color, where you could practically see sort of the THC crystals embedded naturally on the surface, which was mind blowing, especially from a plant breeder and a botanical perspective. And it shook our scientific team in terms of how far can this go in terms of depth. in terms of mapping this, because today China's at the 8th or 9th generation of Yunma, and they're sort of kind of adapting that. The Canadians have of course sort of gradually catching up. The United States has had Colorado seed breeding program, but India itself has never actually taken the opportunity to map out different land races, strains, and cultivars. A lot of it is sort of anecdotal information, and that's why we realize being able to plug in this kind of more data led understanding about what exactly is indigenous to India's heritage and what we can maximize for industrial and medical value, I think is sort of the gold at the end of the rainbow, in a figure of speech.
Yeah, fantastic. I mean, it's an area that I'm personally fascinated by, and not to dwell on it too much, but while I've got you on the show, assuming you've kind of done because research is a big part of what you've done, the research on the makeup of these landrace strains. Again, Dr. Russo mentioned that they're much more diverse in their cannabinoid profile than commercially cultivated strains, which are obviously predominantly done for either specifically CBD or THC. And, he also mentioned that myrcene is very high in most commercially available strains. What have you found in the strains, the landrace strains that you've been cataloging in terms of the diversity of the cannabinoid profiles?
So most of our data is proprietary, but something that we are soon going to publish, I can give you a little bit of an insight into that. What we have identified is a common factor in certain latitudes that are giving us unique plants with higher ratios of THCV, which is the Varin version of the THC cannabinoid in that case, which has actually showcased a lot of benefit in type 2 diabetic patients, as well as few other neurological conditions as well. So the point is that we have plants with unique components like THCV. We are also seeing certain unique terpenes like beta caryophyllene as well as alpha pinene within our cannabis plants. But again, the point is eventually for us to breed them with something that would be relatively high in yield to be able to commercialize it. So, yeah.
Yeah, there's loads. We could just do a show specifically on that, which I might come and revisit with you. Cool. Okay, well, thank you. That's great. And it sounds like you guys are doing some really exciting stuff. But back to the main topic of India in general. Again, we could go on for quite a while about this, but do you want to talk a bit about sort of the role of cannabis historically in India? You've mentioned that it grows in the wild, everywhere, basically. How has it figured historically in India, and what's its connection to sort of Ayurveda? And maybe you can explain actually what Ayurveda is to the audience.
So, predominantly, as I was saying at the start of the podcast, Ayurveda is a form of traditional medicine that is being practiced majorly in South Asia, not only in India. Ayurveda is a form of medicine that's practiced in Nepal, in Sri Lanka, and even in Bhutan and Myanmar. India's relation with cannabis goes as far as the start of the plant itself. Has been mentioned that Gautam Buddha used to actually consume one seed of cannabis, one hemp seed every day to kind of maintain his nutrition. There are also a lot of correlates drawn with our Lord, the Creator Lord, which is Lord Shiva. We have major Hindu parts of the country consume bhang, which is the leaves of the cannabis plant, as an offering to the god, and at the same time also as an aphrodisiac for themselves to have some fun. Bhang, for example, as I mentioned, is actually completely legal in certain states in India. One can buy bhang of very local stores as well, where it's legalized by the state government over there. We also have certain functions like Holi, which is the festival of colors, and that is predominantly also a festival when people consume different kind of edible drinks. I think Jahan will also add on to a few more culturally relevant aspects of cannabis.
Great. So, so now, as Avnish mentioned, there's sort of a lot of intertwined history, and I think I'd like to point out two examples. Number one, a lot of tourists who visit India, a lot of people who visit India, especially around Mumbai, ask about the Ajanta and the Ellora caves, which is sort of a historical monument and a sort of a historical set of caves. What we learned in India, I think, and archaeologists discovered this in the last 5, 6 years, was there is a stark difference between these two caves in terms of how their upkeep and structure continues to exist. The major reason being Ellora caves, as compared to Ajanta, actually use lime made out mixed with the fiber or stalk of the hemp or the bhang plant about 1500 years ago to line the caves, which still maintained and preserved a lot of kind of structural integrity. And in fact, I think there's sort of a paper published about this from a university in Maharashtra, and it really pointed to how deeply intertwined India's history is. And I think sort of a second nugget of history was a little, I think, dragging a little further forward into about 1854 as compared to the previous point, when a French microbiological testing and sort of biotech research institute, I believe, had partnered with the East India Company, or they had come independently to evaluate the use of Indian hemp for medical purposes across India. And they had actually published a paper documenting quantitatively and qualitatively how Indian hemp was part of common folklore and remedies in medicine, and how it was sort of being utilized for a variety of different indication areas, which is something, of course, incidentally, that Ayurveda specifically touches upon, considering with the upwards of 50 to 70 plus, some say close to 90 to 100 plus different classical and proprietary Ayurvedic formulations that either have the leaf, that is the bhang leaf extract or the powder as an ingredient, or the bhang or the hemp seed or the seed powder as an ingredient, which kind of really speaks testament to a lot of the common, I would say, the common conception around cannabis being one of the five holy herbs that were kind of listed under things like the Atharva Veda. And I think this really speaks true to that and holds monument to that truth as well from a historical perspective.
Yeah, and also one fun fact is that the word anandamide, which is basically denoting one of the endocannabinoids within the human system, is derived from the Sanskrit word ananda, which stands for bliss. So that the scientist has also given it that cultural influence, thinking about the relevance of cannabis in India.
Yes, yeah. It's an often quoted fact, isn't it? And wow, going back to caves, hemp was being used in cave construction it shows just how kind of deep it's rooted in history. Thank you for that, guys. Maybe we sort of bring it a bit up to date now. There's huge amounts we could talk about the history, but maybe we talk a bit about what's going on today in India. At a high level, what is the legal situation in relation to medical cannabis, CBD, and hemp? And India has a state system as well. So how does it all fit in?
Correct, correct. So, from the regulatory perspective, cannabis is on the concurrent list as part of our Narcotic Drugs and Psychotropic Substances Act of 1985. By concurrent list, I mean it is an item that the state and the center cohesively decide on various policy and legal matters. As far as the current regulatory framework is concerned, there are a few states that have issued R&D licenses to government as well as certain private organizations to study cannabis and its use for medical as well as industrial purposes. The state of Uttarakhand is the hilly state, the Himalayan state, is one of the first states to have an industrial hemp policy, which defines the roles and responsibilities of different government officials as well as the regulations for the farmers and processors in that case. It's a legislation that came into effect in 2016, 2017. And being the first few formative, there's still a lot of teething problems that we are facing, but we believe with the time those will kind of come through. As far as the medical aspect of cannabis is concerned, we have Ayurveda, which I mentioned at the start is a traditional form of medicine and is used as predominantly alternative medicine in India. And cannabis forms to be one of the essential herbs within that aspect. But at the same time, it is also a Schedule E1 substance, which means that cannabis has certain toxic properties as per Ayurveda and it needs to be treated with that sophistication. So we have to get certain specific licenses, etc., to hold these substances as well as manufacture products. The product sale is not regulated state-wise. As far as the products are licensed by central authorities, they could be sold everywhere. There are certain concerns with regards to importing isolated CBD products into India, considering the regulator is asking questions such as what is the status of the product in the host nation? Is it a food or is it a nutraceutical or is it a pharmaceutical ingredient? What is it? So from that perspective, bringing CBD isolates into India immediately is a little tricky. but there are different opportunities to look internally as far as our other alternative routes are concerned. So India's pretty much, I believe, at the start of this kind of regulation. And the better part is India doesn't need to change its regulatory framework in order to include cannabis. The way the regulatory framework exists, there could be a lot of additions as well as exploring that framework in a much more detailed way is the step forward going ahead as well.
Yeah, we're all at the beginning, I guess, and everyone's struggling to define things as well, not just in India, but in the rest of the world as well. So it sounds like quite familiar issues. But as you say, given the historical relationship with cannabis, it's, there's plenty enough going on inside India itself that you don't necessarily need to look outside at the moment. So, I mean, from a, I guess, trend perspective, where do you see the growth in India? How are people kind of interacting with cannabis? Is CBD a big kind of new exciting area that everyone's thinking about, or is it even hemp as a material? Is that coming back as a more prominent material now? Where do you see the kind of growth for your business?
That's a great question, Anuj. And I'd like to point to kind of a few statistics. For example, being in 2018-19, the Ministry of Social Justice came out with a magnitude of substance abuse report that essentially categorized that the number of users of cannabis, whether ganja, that's the flower, whether bhang, that's the leaf, or whether charas, that's the resin. The total approximate estimated users in India is about 32 to 35 million people, which is almost, I would say, about a major crux of the entire Canadian population. And that really put it into perspective for us that even at a conservative estimate, the market and sort of the consumer perspective and horizon is huge. And the sentiment towards CBD and cannabis's medical usage is building majorly in favor. Whether we are dealing with allopathic doctors or Ayurvedic practitioners and traditional doctors who are building greater understanding and are more inclined to conduct trials, studies, research, and be able to speak in favor of cannabis's therapeutic usage in certain indication areas as well. Whether it were from a policymaker or bureaucrat front, where a major crux of the state and the central government bureaucrats themselves have been very progressive and open-minded about not just aping the West in terms of policy, but being able to adapt policy as per Indian circumstance, which is sort of a strategic value addition for industry players like Bo-hee-ko. And I think the major element is, of course, the digitization, the hyper growth of digitization in India, where today you have millions of potential consumers having access to digital platforms looking for solutions on nutrition, immunity, plant-based, natural, vegetarian phenomenons, which exactly falls into the dialect that an average Indian customer and household is aiming to hear. The key is being able to fit in cannabis or bhang, as is colloquially known, into that conversation in a more pointed and more, I would say, in a kind of much more disciplined and academic as well as a fun consumer fashion, without taking away from the seriousness of its positive impact as well. So I think that is generally where the marketplace is and where the consumer sentiment is, where today you have fly-by-night operators who are taking advantage of the fact that thousands, if not thousands of patients from across the country, and there are a lot of not-for-profits who've done some great work across the country supplying cannabis oil locally extracted, sort of using homegrown techniques to cancer patients for free, whereas you have other fly-by-night operators charging a massive premium on something that's not even approved. So that's where we realize that there is enormous scope to create greater awareness about the benefits of cannabinoids, cannabis and hemp, so that when the consumer is coming to the doorstep, they are more aware, and be able to build a much more kind of, I would say, generalized platform and not lay specific to one subset or demographic or just on an age criteria. For example, we have an arthritis oil product, which is one of India's first CBD-based topical oil Ayurvedic products for arthritis. And what we've seen interestingly is most orders we get for such products actually come from patients, from people between 20 to 40 years old. So we investigated and we found out why. We realized it's youngsters who are actually recommending such products to their grandparents or their parents and educating them and creating the awareness such that today grandmothers had placed an order for, say, one bottle, and they came back so happy a week later where they had shared it amongst their entire friend group and they were ordering 10 or 15 bottles. So being able to build that level of ground awareness, we realize, has been the biggest challenge, and that's why the journey has been a lot about the grassroots from the onset. And I'm sure Avnish also has some thoughts echoing sort of the sentiment as well.
As far as the Indian use case is concerned, it's still evolving. It is still begun. We do see a lot of people kind of using hemp seeds as a part of their daily nutrition in some or the other way. We are seeing a lot of health influencers coming on board to talk about the use of omegas and the kind of digestible proteins that hemp has. The conversation of CBD, I believe, is just about begun, because now that there is availability of product, certain types of products there, so that people can use it, see it, experience it. And we also know that the cannabis market is a little bit of an organic market. It will take a little bit of time for people to use these products, see the benefits, eventually recommend to their friends and family, and then it catapulting into a much bigger movement as well. So we are very positive the way it has begun. We do have a lot of Indians who already know about CBD, and the way like cannabis has been commercialized and westernized in this way. So finally, India is also looking at it as a real business opportunity. So slowly, you will see a lot more hemp and cannabis companies from India talking about different products that they are making.
Yeah, yeah, lots of exciting times there, and really interesting what Jahan was saying about older people getting involved, who I think a lot of people naturally assume are more conservative and maybe a bit more wary of what they perceive to be a drug. Perhaps it's slightly different in India given the kind of the cultural roots, but still really encouraging to see. And actually, it's probably an age demographic that could really benefit from the medicinal qualities of the plant.
Absolutely, absolutely. So definitely we're positive about the demographic part of India, and also the way India is eventually going to catch on to the global wave and kind of really make commercial use of the cannabis. That's that.
Fantastic. Cool. Well, look, guys, we're getting towards the end of the show. Like I said, so much stuff we could talk about. But my usual kind of final question is, what did your parents say when you said that you were starting a cannabis business?
I think in my case, it was pretty straightforward I was pretty straightforward with them, saying that, there is this, I'm sure you know what cannabis is, and that people have lots of perceptions about it, but it has all these amazing uses. So it's just something that, everything can have a wrong use. Like I could have a gun today and I could use it for protection, or I could use it for violence. And that kind of conversation with my parents struck off pretty well. And secondly, they also understood that the more unique things that child does, the better his opportunity at doing a future MBA is. So it was kind of, that was also a good thing in their mind partly. And I think Jahan has probably a unique story to this.
Yeah, no, so I think mine could be summarized in two parts. I think first being that it was in fact during a trip to Australia with my mom to meet my family, extended family, that I came across how towns in Australia and doing a road trip there, and towns in Australia were actually using hemp constructively and cannabis constructively. So I think that broke the ice, made the conversation easier, and I think perhaps the best way I could sum it up would be to say that the first quite a few of the first brainstorming meetings of the first year, couple of years of Bo-hee-ko, whenever we needed to get out of office and open up mind space, were at home, where of course my mother kind of made it very kind of open and comfortable for people to talk, discuss, share, innovate ideas, because I guess all of us come from families which of course want us to do the right thing in life, but want us to do something we love and do it passionately, regardless of whatever it would be. And being able to create a legacy is essentially the end goal, that in the dream state of what we aim to achieve with Bo-hee-ko, which I think kind of went down quite well, quite smoothly at the first time we brought it up.
That's good. It's great to hear. And really, yeah, again, very mature approach to how you guys are getting into it. So I think that stands you all in good stead. Look, guys, it's been such a really interesting chat, and I love what you guys are doing, and the kind of all-round holistic approach, and really kind of very much rooted in the science and the R&D. So I look forward to big things coming out from Bo-hee-ko. And I would love to get you guys back on. I think we could do a deep dive on a number of the aspects we've talked about today. So let's stay in touch.
Definitely. It was nice speaking with you as well. Have a good day.
Thank you. Cheers.
Thanks so much for your time, Anuj, and looking forward to continuing the conversations going over the podcast as well.
Absolutely. Cool. Take care, guys.